Nah, I'm good. Just don't ask me to lead the scene.
Okay. I think we have enough song leaders.
Well, I believe, well, that's loud. That's loud. I believe it's about time to get started. Not that my voice is ready for it, but yeah, that speaker's kind of. Let's see if we can move this down here. For y'all that have never experienced me teaching class, this is not my first time. It may feel like it, but it's probably not my first time. I taught the teenage class for, 12 to 15 years, and then I taught this adult class. But somebody somewhere got tired of me and said, you need to go. So they retired me. And if you don't know, I'm not supposed to be here right now. I was supposed to be in Alaska. I flew to Alaska last Wednesday. I was going on a hunting trip. Fly from Atlanta, Anchorage. I get to Anchorage, and I catch the next leg going to Nome, Alaska. And if anybody knows where Nome is, it's right there on the Bering Strait, Bering Sea. And it never sunshines in Nome. However, the day I got there, it was the most beautiful day you've ever seen in your life. It was 60 degrees, not a cloud in the sky, and the water was as calm as I've ever seen it. Absolute glorious day. So me and the 5 other guys that were going hunting, load all of our stuff. We carry it to the garage where we're going. You have to repack your stuff into what we call dry bags. You know, it keeps everything from getting wet, which is the nature of the beast in Nome, Alaska. It rains every day in the summer, and it snows all winter long. So about 3 minutes before we were supposed to bags and put them in our bush plane to take us into the Arctic Circle where I was going hunting, the lead guide that was there walks in and he said, "Whole trip's been canceled." Excuse me? No, the whole trip's been canceled. I said, "You're joking, right?" He said, "No, I'm not joking. The lead guide up in the Arctic Circle just got life flighted out to Anchorage. Don't know what happened, but we can't have anybody hunting if we don't have a master guide on site and count." Didn't you? Yes, but the other guide cannot get here until August 6th, which I believe is today. So, I flew to Nome and got to eat at the pizza place and flew back home. So, I at least got a halfway decent pizza. Best frozen pizza in Nome. So, anyway, we fly home. I get home at 3 o'clock Sunday morning, which is why I looked like I'd been run over by a truck Sunday morning when I got here. And then I get a call Monday from my guide and said, "You better be glad that you left." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because the bush plane pilot just crashed the plane." So the plane I was supposed to be on is laying upside down in the Arctic with its propellers broke and the wings cracked. So God has a funny way of doing things sometimes. So a lot of times you'll look at it like, man, I was disappointed, but not necessarily as much today, okay? So, yeah, so anyway, I'm in Calhoun, Georgia, I guess where I'm supposed to be, and Sunday morning after we were leaving out, Adrian walks up to me and says, "Oh, by the way, guess what you need to do Wednesday night?" So here I am teaching, instead of being in the Arctic tundra in Alaska. But do what? Yeah, so, but so anyway, that's how you got me tonight. So I'm not really up to news on anything here. So if there's somebody that we know that we need to pray for, let me know, and we'll get that taken care of. Anything needs to be announced before we get going? Yes, okay. Okay. Keep praying for Melanie, Kay's sister. Yep.
She's at home and doing much better. And is going to stay there in Alabama for a while. She has another couple of weeks, and her daughter's coming in for Davis to be there for a couple of weeks.
Yeah. Jennifer coming in. Okay.
And Diana Lester, of course, y'all know, passed away.
Right.
Kenny and I went to visitation this evening.
Okay. William, would you lead us in prayer before we get started, please? Amen. All right. I did not hear you. Oh, yeah. 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 Dawn had talked to Deanna, I guess, and Deanna says that she wants trying to do stuff, pour her own coffee when she can't even use her own wrists and stuff. So, she broke both of her wrists, right? Okay. Okay, so let's all remember Linda Bunch in our prayers. So, picking a subject. I had to pick a subject really quick, and normally, for y'all that have been in my classes before, I'll typically pick a subject and run like John did for weeks at a time, so I can stop somewhere and we can go on time. Not so today. Didn't really know how much or how long I would be teaching this class, so because it's going to be alternating between several of us. But anyway, so I just picked one subject, and it's kind of a subject that I've explained before. My mind kind of works on a mathematical basis, logic, is something that I've always just tried to zero in on. And a lot of times people say faith and logic don't go together. But I think that's not so much the case. I think that there are many things in the Bible that you can prove logically. Why? Because the Creator, the advancer, the being that created logic had to be logical. Okay? So I think if you study Scripture, yes, there are places for faith. But I think logic backs up faith a lot of times. So I picked a subject that I wanted to kind of touch on, that John started on when he started in Genesis going forward, and we'll start about the 12th chapter. And that is where Genesis 12, verse 1, it says, "The Lord had said to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram departed as the Lord had instructed, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all of his wealth, his livestock, and all the people he had taken into his household in Haran, and headed for the land of Canaan. When they arrived in Canaan, Abram traveled through the land as far as Shechem. There he set up camp beside the oak of Moreh. At that time, the area was inhabited by Canaanites. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "I will give you this land to your descendants." And Abram built an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord who had appeared to him. What did God tell Abram to do? Leave everything that you've ever known. Get out of here. But I promise you it won't be for naught. Right? Isn't he giving him a promise? Now, maybe not the other promise that we read about later, but he's telling him, go to a land that I'll show you. So Abram really doesn't have a clue where he's going. All he got is a promise from some God, of which there were plenty of people around the world that would tell you there's more than one God. Maybe he understood who this God was, maybe he didn't. But he believed him. He believed what he said, or else he wouldn't have picked up and left. He wouldn't have carried his wife with him and all of his wealth and all of the people that he carried with him. Because there's a lot of things that could happen to you when you're traveling like that, especially if you're going to a foreign land where they don't know you. They don't know if you're coming as friend or foe. And it's already said that there were a bunch of Canaanites there. Well, who's the Canaanites? I don't know. I'm from the land of Ur. He said, so he had to have some faith and believe that this God is telling him something's going to happen. Just do what I tell you and everything will be okay. Well, tonight we're going to discuss the promise of Abraham. God promised Abraham, his descendants, that he'd give them land, the land of Canaan, in Genesis 12 and again in Genesis 15, 1 through 6. Abraham, or Abram at this time, was 75 years old when God made the promise to him. Well, we know that if we keep reading on, that if he promised that he would give him the land and all of his children, what else do we read about Abram at this point? He's got a wife, but notice it didn't mention his child. Why? Didn't have one. He's 75 years old. Last time I checked, that's 15 years older than I am. I'm not really wanting to have kids at this point in my life. You know, I've already got 4 grandkids. Kids are not something that would be, that I'm going out of my way to do at this point in my life, especially 15 years from now. But I realized people were different probably back then, and lifespans may have been a little different. Maybe, maybe not. We can read about that a little later. But we do know that he and Sarah, whose name was changed to Sarah, along when his name was changed to Abraham, they had a son. The son's name was Isaac. And even though Sarah's handmaiden and Sarah tried to fix God's promise through man's way or our way of doing things, didn't necessarily work out to the best for Esau. Not Esau, I'm sorry. Ishmael. My brain went dead for a second. Although he loved Ishmael, God loved him, Abraham loved him. And you see a lot of stuff that happened because of Ishmael, both good and bad, throughout the rest of the I guess, Old Testament, as we call it. Abraham's son, Isaac, was born when he was approximately 100 years old. And that is the key to the fulfillment of God's promise. So he had to wait 25 years to even have the promise fulfilled, or even start to be fulfilled. I don't know about y'all, but I'm somewhat impatient. Probably more patient now than I was when I was 30. Judy could probably tell you that. Whole lot more patient than I was when I was 20. Still impatient though, even at my age. So, well, then Isaac gave birth to a son, Jacob, whose name later changed to Israel. But Jacob, who is Abraham's grandson, basically moved to Egypt. Not because he wanted to, but we read he had to, right? And how did God get him there? Because Jacob had 12 sons. And Joseph, which I don't know how to put it, but I can jokingly say Dylan's my favorite son. Why? Because I don't have but one. You know, it's real easy to say he's my favorite. But if I had two, I don't know how you could say that. But Jacob said that Joseph was his favorite. A little weird from our standard. I don't know that it was weird to them. But from our standpoint as Americans in the 21st century, that's kind of weird. We'll go on. Joseph became second in charge of Egypt. And that's how Jacob and all the brothers and the whole family got moved there. So the Israelites, or Jacob's name changed to Israel, the Israelites moved to Egypt. And it says that there was, let me see. Genesis 15, verse 4. Let's look at that. Verse 4 through 6, it says, Then the Lord said to him, No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir. Then the Lord took Abram inside and said to him, Look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have. And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. Abram believed him, and God loved him even before he believed him, but he knew he was going to believe him, and they had a bond that just, when you think about it, look up into the sky and count all the stars. I don't know if y'all have ever been in an area that doesn't have any what we call light pollution, where there's no light whatsoever, and you look in the sky. I remember one time Dawn and I, we were in the Caribbean. I think we were in the Turks and Caicos Islands. And we had rented a house, and we turned all the lights off in the house, and we laid out on the back deck at night. And it was the first time she had ever seen the Milky Way. She said, What's that big white streak across the sky? And I started laughing. I said, Honey, that's the Milky Way. Why do you think they call it the Milky Way? Because it looks like a big white streak going across the sky and all the stars and everything in it. Well, Abram is there with God, and God says, Look up in the sky. And all the stars. You're going to have more family members than that in the future. That's kind of hard to believe when you don't even have one kid, you know? So, but it says he believed him. So let's move on. I go that because the one thing I wanted to get to is the question that I was pondering while this whole lesson, and that is, at what point did this promise from God come true? Have you ever thought about it? At what point did Abraham's children and grandchildren and generations after that, at what point did the promise that you'll have more family members, lineage, than you can count stars in the sky? At what point did that come true? I agree with you, Judy. That is a great point. And we look at it today as we're part of those children, right? Because we're believers of the faith of the one that came along later on, Jesus, and we're part of that family. But if you take it literally, when would that point have come? Now you kind of get my idea where sometimes logic gets in and sometimes it doesn't, but great point. Right. And I almost believe from Abraham's perspective, even though he didn't even have a child yet, he believed it as if it were true at that very moment when God promised it. But for us that need more concrete and evidence and number crunching, hold on to that thought for just a second, okay? So, Abraham's family numbered 75 people when they began living in Egypt. Well, where do we get that from? Well, in Genesis 46:27, we read that there's 70 members that moved to Egypt, right? So how do we get the number 75? Because if you read Stephen's account of what happened in Acts 7 and verse 14, when he's recounting this, he says there's 75. Is that not a discrepancy between 70 and 75? I mean, for us number crunchers, 70 is not equal to 75. And 75 is not equal to 70. So how do you account for that? There you go. Joseph is already there. And a lot of the times they did not count some of the women involved, okay? So it just determined by the perspective that you look at. And so what I went to was get some biblical scholarly idea on this. How does this interact with each? Well, the Septuagint, which is, I don't know if, I'm not trying to get too intellectual, but the Septuagint is the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. The Masoretic text is the Hebrew version, okay? And the Hebrews and the Greeks counted things differently by family-wise. And I went through, and I've got all kinds of information. I'm not to death with it, but scholars propose that the Septuagint includes the sons of Ephraim and Manasseh who were born in Egypt in the total, along with Jacob and his wives. The Masoretic text, or the Hebrew text, on the other hand, may not include these family members in the final count. And the counting methods, some scholars interpret the difference as a matter of different counting methods, with the Hebrew text focusing on direct descendants and the Septuagint including the wider family, okay? What I did find was I went to all these scholars, and it says, with that said, the scholars and theologians all agree that there is no actual contradiction, as both the numbers are valid depending on the textual tradition of which version you're reading. In other words, the Greek version or the Hebrew version, because they account for people differently. So, with that being said, before somebody got upset and said, well, it says 70, in the other place it says 75. That's what you got to remember. Stephen was what? Greek. So it makes sense that he would quote the Greek verbiage. Okay? So, but from the time that Abram, aka Abraham, was given this promise by God to the time that the Israelite nation, Hebrew, left Egypt, in other words, the Exodus, how much time was that? 430 years. That's what Scripture tells us. My question then, the reason I'm doing I'm going into this is Scripture suggests that 215 years passed from the time that Joseph's family joined him in Egypt. In other words, from Abraham to Joseph, when they did the 3 generations, and by the time they got to Joseph, and Jacob moving to Egypt to join his son and the other 11 sons along the way was about 215 years. So if we're saying there's 430 years from the time Abraham got the promise to the time they left Egypt, how many years did they live in Egypt? 215. 215 and 215 makes 430. So there's about 215 years that Joseph's family and their descendants went from those 75 people to what scholars believe are millions of people. How can that be true? Have you ever thought about it? They were fruitful. They were fruitful. So the book of Numbers, in chapter 1, specifically in verses 20 through 46, it's clear on how many men who were 20 years old or older and able to go to war when they left Egypt. The total number of men between age 20 and whatever age you were when you couldn't fight in war anymore, that may have been in your 40s, 50s, or even 60s, but the men numbered 3,550. So if you go to Numbers and you look at that, some Bible versions read it out in actual wordage. Some have charts in it. I printed one of those charts right here, and it says that Reuben, Jacob's oldest son, had 46,500. Simeon, 59,300. Gad, 45,650. Judah, 74,600. Issachar, 54,400. Zebulun, 57,400. Ephraim, wait a minute, Ephraim wasn't a son of Jacob. How'd he get into being a tribe leader? Remember, Joseph was the head of it, but when he moved to Egypt, he was removed as that, and his two sons took his place. His two sons were Ephraim and Manasseh. Well, how's there 12 tribes if you just take one out? If there's 12 others and you take one out, doesn't that leave 11? Yeah. Which one didn't get a land allotment? Levi. So you had to take two out. So they had to have two to replace them. Joseph's two sons replaced them. And that's how you have the 12 tribes. So Ephraim had 40,500, Manasseh 32,200, Benjamin 35,400, Dan 62,700, Asher 41,500, and Naphtali 53,400. Total that up, 603,550. Fighting men. 215 years. We went from 75 people to at least 603,550. And that's just fighting men. Does not count anyone under the age of 20. Does not count a single woman. May not count any of the men in their 60s or 70s. That's subjective because they may or may not have been the age to be able to fight in war. But we do know that there's 603,550. Okay? So, what time frame are we looking at in biblical history? This is approximately, the Exodus is happening somewhere around 1,450 years before Christ. Now that may not mean a lot to a lot of people, but we're 2,100 years after Christ. So basically 2/3 of the time that has been since Christ was before Christ, 1,400 years. So with that being said, how long did it, going back to my question, how long did it take for God's promise to come true? Obviously, you could count 603,550 people because they did it. But his promise was, you won't be able to even count all of your descendants. That's how great your is going to be. So, that being said, when Joseph's family joined him in Egypt, skeptics of the Bible's reliability, skeptics of the reality of an actual Israelite exodus from Egypt, and skeptics say that there's no way that in 215 years you could have people that the Bible says you could. But if you take the 603,550 and you just kind of do some simple math in there, you can come up real easy with there was at least 2 million people that were probably leaving in the Exodus. I'll get into some of the math in a minute, but James Hoffmeyer is an Egyptian. He was born in Egypt, but he's an American. Okay, his parents were Egyptologists, or they dug archaeology. They dug in the sands there in Egypt, and that's where he was born. But he's a famous professor at Harvard and at Wheaton College here in the U.S. He's still alive. So I checked on him. I checked with Umberto Cassuto, which is an Italian scholar, Philip Ryken, which is a biblical scholar, and he is the actual president of Wheaton College now, and Sir Colin John Humphreys, who's a professor of material science at the University of Cambridge and professor of experimental physics at the Royal Institute in London. So we're talking some guys that have a little bit of brain power here. Not saying they're right, not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying they are some of the, I guess, most knowledgeable, known people who have written books and have to defend their logic to their peers. Okay? Again, doesn't mean they're right, doesn't mean they're wrong either. But anyway, these guys, I looked at it. Some of the estimates of biblical scholars are as high as there was possibly 15 million people that came out of Egypt. You'd have to be really fertile for that to happen. Okay? Not saying it couldn't, but if you allowed it to have 200 years, that could happen real easy. But if we keep it to probably 60, 70 years, it's mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Bingo. Yeah, some estimates are as high as 15 million, and other scholars simply say the Exodus never even happened. But somewhere in there is the correct estimation, although the above scholars that I quoted differ on how many. Each one came to a different consensus, but if you take these four plus the other hundreds, come to a consensus somewhere around 2.5 million. Okay? 2.5 million that exited Egypt during the Exodus that's described in the Old Testament. Now, in Numbers 1 through 4, says a year after Israel's departure from Egypt. So we're a year after, it says the Lord spoke to Moses in the tabernacle, which I looked up the tabernacle. In Hebrew, it means the tent of meeting. That's where he met God in the wilderness in Sinai on the first day of the second month, which if you look at their calendar, it was typically, this was somewhere around middle April, okay, of that year. He said, from the whole community of Israel, record the names of all your warriors by their clans and families. List all the men 20 years old and older who are able to go to war. You and Aaron must register the troops, and you will be assisted by one family leader from each tribe. And then it lists all the ones they'll be helped by, and then it goes on, like I said, verses 20 through 46, and tells how many each one was there. So if you take all those numbers that I listed there, Judah is the most productive. Why does that seem interesting to anyone? What tribe was David from? Judah. What tribe was Jesus from? Judah. If you go down the list, Judah had more people leaving in the Exodus than any other tribe. Just a point. Mm-hmm.
It says all those the Levites not count.
Right. Which I was actually getting to that. So if we assume the tribe of Levi was similar, if you take all that 603,550 and divide it by the 12, you'll come up with approximately 50,000 per tribe on average. Okay? So by that number, we can assume the Levites were probably around 50,000. So there's probably around 650,000 men age 20 and older coming out. But remember, they were the priestly tribe, and they could serve as a priest. How old did you have to be a priest? 30. Yeah. If you look at Old Testament rules and all of that, you typically had to be about 30. Okay? Which is why I find it interesting that when Jesus was baptized, which priests typically had to be baptized, Jesus was baptized. At what age do we think he was baptized at? 30. So, again, God designed stuff a whole lot better than us men probably ever would have. But, yes, according to that, there are probably somewhere around 50,000 Levites, not counting their wives or children or anything like that. But according to verse 3, these individuals aged 19 and below were not included in the tally. And if we assume that at the time the Hebrew people on average were living to age 70, and I use that because in Psalms 90 verse 10, y'all can look it up, it says lifespan is 70 years. Okay. I know it's not the exact same time frame, but we're still within 300 or 400 years probably of this time frame when that psalm was written. So if we assume age 70 is on average, then roughly 27% of the population was not included in Moses' tally. So if we assume all age brackets had approximately the same number of Hebrews, and if so, the Hebrew population was roughly 1,650,000 when it comes to men and children. Do what? My notes? This is my calculations. I didn't. No, it's not in the book of Numbers. So how could the Hebrew population be in the millions in just 15 years? Statistically, which is what I was doing, Judy, we can arrive at a reasonable population estimate at different times in history. You can go back and you'll find different populations. I mean, basically around the time of Jesus, because the Romans did a lot of census and stuff like that, we can come up, there's probably somewhere around 65 to 68 million people in the Roman Empire when Jesus was alive. Okay, so I mean, we can do statistical population measures and stuff like that. Well, are they accurate? Yeah, give or take, here and there. So, but based upon certain assumptions, if the initial Hebrew population in Egypt was 75, and the average age was 70 when they passed away, and they continued having children for half of their life, meaning probably being fertile somewhere from age 12, 13, if you go by, and you got to remember this is prior to Moses' law, 12-ish, 13, all the way up to about 35 or 40, and they're having children. Okay? If you follow that, and if they had about 8 children on average, and you may say that's a lot, read Exodus 1, verse 7. It says, but their descendants had many children and grandchildren. In fact, they multiplied so greatly that they became extremely powerful and filled the land. Then we can move on to verse 12. And it says, but the more Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread, and the more alarmed the Egyptians became. And then move on to verse 20. And it says, so God was good to the midwives, and the Israelites continued to multiply, growing more and more powerful. Were they fertile? It says it 3 times. There's 3 biblical verses specifically talking about how fertile God made these people. Okay? And if you go back and read some of the promise, it wasn't just them. It was their cattle. It was their sheep. Everything that they touched multiplied. Right? And they were given, I don't know if y'all ever looked at a map of Egypt, that Delta region, right there where the Nile flows into it, and I say I could even grow stuff there. I am not a green thumb. I have other talents, but that's not one of them. And I've been there. I've seen it. I've been to Cairo. I've been to Alexandria. I've been to Port Said. Basically that whole area, and it's very fertile. Okay? Just like the people were. The Bible tells us they were very fertile. So it might not be out of the question to say that they averaged somewhere around 8 kids each. I won't go into all of that, but I don't think it'd be out of the question to say that. And typically they live to see the births of half of their grandchildren on average, if you understand that, meaning that they lived 1.5 life. In other words, they lived their life, and by the time their grandkids were there, it was already half of their grandkids' life. If you statistically get all those numbers in there, you'll come up with somewhere around 2.5 million. Okay? If the generation lengths were slightly longer than that, meaning maybe a little longer than 70 years, or even they had 9 or 10 kids per family, you start to multiply by millions. That's why some scholars get really big estimates. Some scholars get lower estimates. I'm not sure we'll ever know the exact number. But if we use a consensus and we get somewhere around 2.5 million, that's still a bunch of people. And to think about it, and I won't go into all of it because I don't think we have time, but the Egyptians came to hate them more and more. Why? Because they were getting bigger than even the Egyptian nation was. And they were afraid of them because they basically said, well, what if they turn on us? So they're getting scared of them. And guess what? They're living in the most fertile part of Egypt. They've got all the good land. They got all the food. They've got all the animals. What happens if they decide to turn on us? So the Egyptians were not liking them at all. Going back to the question you asked before, what are the chances that only a Hebrew married a Hebrew? All of these statistics I've been adding was only if a Hebrew boy married a Hebrew girl. What happened if they stepped outside of their own family and actually married an Egyptian or somebody else? Do what? No, they never do that. That's what my point. Look at Joseph. He married an Egyptian woman. And his 2 sons were half Egyptian and half Hebrew. Do you think it ever happened out of the other millions? My point exactly. So, look at Leviticus 24:10. It says, one day a man who had an Israelite mother and an Egyptian father came out of his tent and got into a fight with one of the Israelite men. One day a man who had an Israelite mother, a Hebrew, and an Egyptian father came out of the tent and got into a fight with one of the Israelite men. We know the story of Moses. This is where he got in trouble. And it was over an intermarriage. So my point is, it happened. So could there have been more than 2.5 million people? Easily. So again, I don't know the answer to it, but my point is that God's promise, if we'll look at even his own words and the scriptures, and we apply mathematics to it, we can figure out that logically there were millions of people in the Exodus. Millions of people. The norm. I don't know if I probably told y'all this. My dad's one of how many kids, Dylan? 17. My dad is number 13. He's the only guy that I know of that grew up, went into the Air Force, and they rejected him because he had to have his name changed. His birth certificate said boy. Boy Brock. And the great thing is, you can't make this up. When he got his name changed, he changed it to what they'd been calling him his whole life. Guy. He went from a boy to a guy. Okay, so, it could be worse. But, and I was probably 40 years old before I even knew it. My Uncle Sam, which was the brother that was just right under him, his name's not Sam. His name's Wallace. It's like, where do y'all come up with this stuff? But anyways, that's beside the point. But yes, there are big families, okay? My dad was one of 17, and that's in the last 100 years. My dad's 90 years old, so. And now our population's going the other way. But Leviticus 24:10 proves that the Hebrew population could even be higher than what we've been talking about if it was just Hebrew marrying Hebrew, okay? Therefore, if intermarriage with the Egyptians occurred with only 5% of marriages, the final potential Hebrew population rises to approximately 2.7 million. A higher percentage of intermarriages would even extrapolate that out into the 3, 4, maybe even 5 million just by going up a percentage point or two on those intermarriages. Bottom line, the biblical claim about the Hebrew population by the time of Exodus, after only 215 years of reproduction in Egypt, is not unreasonable. On the contrary, Moses' record provides further support of the Bible's truth, of its reliability, and it sheds light on the potential Hebrew household at the time of the Exodus. Again, at what point did God's promise that Abraham's descendants would outnumber the stars in the heavens come true? To answer the point, I Googled, if you look up in the sky, how many stars can you see with the naked eye? Anybody want to guess? It's much lower than you'll ever think. 4,000. You can only see about 4,000 stars with the naked eye. So, again, at what point did God's promise come true? Really early on in Egypt, when the Hebrews were there, if you take it literal. Now, we're not taking it literal. We're taking it as he was promising the Hebrew nation, and that David would come along, and that eventually David's 14th generation grandson or something, Jesus came along. And Jesus is who we can hang our faith on. I did all of this to show the logic of the Bible, because when Moses was writing, he didn't know there was a Jesus. Abram did not even know that there was a Jacob. until Jacob was born, but he took it at faith. Jacob didn't know that his son was named going to be changed to Israel. Isaac didn't know that his son Jacob was going to be changed to Israel, have 12 sons, and one of them would be the leader of Egypt. None of this was known at the time that these men put their faith in God. Can we put our faith in the same God? Absolutely. There's no way that we shouldn't. The Bible proves itself over and over and over again, logically and faith-wise. I hope that's the point y'all get from this lesson tonight. Hope I didn't bore you with too much math, but I just wanted to quickly go through a brain scan of mine that, well, how did God prove all of the things that he was going to do? Abram believed him before it even happened. We can look back at it and surely we can believe him because it's already happened. With that, I appreciate y'all paying attention. Do y'all have any questions? I did write out here, I don't know, what's his name? Something DeGrasse Tyson, the guy that's on TV all the time talking about the solar system and all that. I can't think of his name. Something DeGrasse Tyson. I can't remember, but anyway, I Googled him, and his video said you can see about 3,000 to 4,000 stars at any point in time. So, no, he said if the sky is totally and no moon in it whatsoever. So, but anyway, yeah.